I know what you are thinking right now. You read the title for this video and are wondering, how are there this many timelines in Code Geass? I thought there was only Lelouch of the Rebellion Season 1, Season 2, that film Resurrection, that ruined the ending of Season 2, that spin-off OVA that no one liked or remembered, and that recent anime Roze of something that was hot garbage. These views do not reflect the opinions of my media chops, except when it comes to Roze of the Recapture. You sweet summer child, and I don't even blame you for this ignorance. It's hard to believe what this simple IP that came out in 2006 has turned into, a clusterfuck of so much confusing crap that it competes with the Fate universe and Evangelion on being the most complex anime IP. With that, I want to welcome you to my hell for the last several years where I've been trying to understand all the Code Geass timelines. It doesn't help that the creators keep changing their goddamn minds on stuff. I can't wait to find out what they have in store for the 20th anniversary of Code Geass, which we'll find out like other major announcements on Lelouch's birthday. Until then, I'm going to be your personal guide into this overcomplicated yet nuanced topic where I will present everything that I know as simplistically as possible. Just keep in mind, not everything I state is 100% fact. The people running this IP haven't clarified how everything connects together, so I had to put the pieces together myself at times, and that's putting it lightly. That's why it took so goddamn long to finish this video. Just so we are clear, this is a discussion on the different timelines in Code Geass, not a detailed discussion of all historical events that occurred in Code Geass. That's a video for another time, and believe it or not, it's just as confusing. For example, R1 might have taken place in a single month. I know. That doesn't make any sense. One more thing. I want to thank the people working on the new Geass Wiki project for their help in understanding this complex topic. I will leave a link in the description for those that wish to help them in their noble quest to provide a place containing comprehensive and accurate information on Code Geass without those annoying ads. While we're here, please subscribe to my channel and share this video to anyone who is still confused on this topic, which so far seems to be like most of the fandom, which again is completely understandable. Now, let's get started. For the sake of clarity, I want to create a universal starting point where all timelines branch out from. This isn't 100% confirmed, but most likely happened. So in the beginning, the universe came into existence, and so did the caretaker of time and space, and its aides, the curate and the archive. The caretaker would then arrive on Earth and gave Geass to humanity, or something like that. From this point, every story in the Code Geass IP begins. All the timelines in Code Geass fall under three categories. Category 1, timelines that are or similar to the original anime. Category 2, timelines that are alternative retelling of the original anime's story/continuity. And Category 3, timelines that are imaginary stories. It might seem like Category 1 and 2 are the same thing, but the alternative retellings are radically different from the timelines in Category 1. This will become clear as we go through all the timelines in each of these categories. Let's begin with Category 1, timelines that are or similar to the original anime. Our tour starts with the initial timeline, and in that timeline, it has the original anime that started it all, Code Geass, Lelouch of the Rebellion Season 1, that many refer to as R1 because the second season is called R2. Anyways, that's the first anime in this timeline. They called Season 2 R2 because it was a deviation from the original plans to keep the story going with Stage 26. In a sense, R2 could be considered another timeline. timeline, but that's too complicated, so let's not go there. Anyways, after R1 comes the picture dramas for R1, followed by R2. This initial timeline has grown increasingly more complex over the years, so let's break down how it changed. After the show aired, they added the R2 picture dramas, that's why they're not included here. I assume the audio dramas for these 2 seasons worked in the same way. Now we skip to 2016, 8 years after Lelouch Other Rebellion R2 aired, and when the OVA Akito the Exiled just finished. Since then, many new works were created that can be added to this timeline. So let's re-establish the original anime timeline, aka the main timeline. First comes the prequel manga, Renya of Darkness, the story about Renya, C2, Alto, and Futaba as they help Claire get back to Britannia to take her place as Empress. The story takes place in 1860s Japan, and while never referenced in the original anime since it was created after the fact, it still makes sense to include it as a prequel. This is because it doesn't contradict anything in the original anime. For every other timeline in Category 1, Renya will be the first story in it, unless I specify otherwise. After Renya comes Lelouch Other Rebellion R1 and its picture dramas. Since the initial release, they added a new R1 picture drama, stage 0.97, and the Mass Declaration Contest. There are also audio dramas, which work the same way as the picture dramas. After all of that comes Akito the Exiled, the 5 OVA series. In that OVA, Suzaku and Lelouch, now Julius Kingsley, thanks to Charles, are assisting the Euro-Britannian forces against the EU forces. There is also the main plot involving Akito, Layla, and the W0 unit helping the EU forces fight back against Euro-Britannia. At the end of OVA 5, Rollo comes to rescue Lelouch and Suzaku from their imprisonment, which leads to the events of R2. To be fair, Akito doesn't perfectly fit in between R1 and R2. The technology in Akito is far more advanced than R2, the world map is wrong, Lelouch has his Geass activated even though he didn't in R2 until after C2 cancelled Charles Geass, and it introduced that Skull Immortal being that gave Shin his Geass, and the caretaker of time and space. Neither of these beings had any involvement in the original anime. Despite these problems, I will still slot it here because that was the initial purpose of it, and besides these issues, the rest of it fits in perfectly. Akito the Exiled also has picture dramas that work the same way as in the original anime, but none of them were officially translated. They're still a great time if you liked the characters. And yes, there are also audio dramas for Akito the Exiled that were also never officially translated. Now we get into more controversy, because after Akito the Exiled comes Oz of the Reflection 01. To be more accurate, parts of 01 take place after the start of Akito the Exiled, and part of it during those events. I know, as if this wasn't already confusing enough. Anyways, 01 is the first of 2 parts of Oz of the Reflection. It's a manga, by the way.
In case it wasn't obvious.
Just like with R1, I made up the 01 part, but since the second part is called 02, I figured it made sense to call it that. 01's story takes place in different locations from the original anime, telling a different story with new characters like Olderin and Orpheus that interact with legacy characters. Because most of these things don't contradict the original anime, I don't think it's a problem to include them in this timeline. I have more things to say about Oz, but first, after 01 comes R2 and its picture dramas. Alongside the events of R2, 02, the second part of Oz of the Reflection, occurs. Just like before, most of the events occur elsewhere and thus don't contradict the original anime. That being said, it isn't a perfect fit because of the retcons, which includes ones from 01. The biggest is Marika's survival, the Glinda Knights saving Nunnally, what happened at Ashford, which contradicts the events of R2, and so forth. Lelouch even works with Maribel after becoming the Emperor of Britannia. In my opinion, most of these changes are designed to clarify many parts of R2 that didn't make any sense, so I don't see a problem with including it here. But this isn't confirmed by anyone, so feel free to disagree. If we are going to include Oz, then there's also the photo novels which take place alongside the events of 01. These mostly follow Orpheus's side of things, and he even tells Cornelia where the Geass Order is located, retconning a huge plot hole from R2. We also have to include the Oz Little Reflection picture drama, which is about Alderaan and Maribel's backstory, including their relationship, what happened to Mary's mother, and why Mary lost her claim to the throne, and so forth. Considering this is more of a prequel, it probably should go before 01 in the timeline. Now that we are done with the Oz package, let's get back to R2. This season also had audio dramas, which work the same way as the ones from R1, except that some of them are imaginary stories, so those won't be included here. Next, there's a picture drama called Turn 25, which takes place after Final Turn RE, so that comes next in the timeline. You may not have watched or heard of it, but should be familiar with this famous artwork that comes from it. Following that, we have to discuss the Miraculous Anniversary and the Miraculous Birthday OVAs. The Miraculous Anniversary takes place during R1 since Nunnally isn't a viceroy and is with Lelouch at Ashford Academy. Miraculous Birthday is more complicated. The majority of the story is clearly fictional given how Lelouch, Rollo, and Shirley appear as ghosts to help fight against Neo-Chinese Federation forces, so this obviously would fall under imaginary stories. The ending of the OVA is a different thing, as it showcases what happens after R2, including the introduction of Margaret Wolper and Liu Boy, someone we only recently learned the name of thanks to Lost Stories. It even showcased the future drill weapon that the Gurren type special would later have. I will put the end of the Miraculous Birthday after picture drama Turn 25, and the rest will go into imaginary stories. So you must be thinking, that's it, right? We're done with the timeline?
You'd think so, but you'd be wrong.
We got 3 more things to add. First is Fragments of Mosaic, an anthology series of novels with stories that take place during different parts of the original anime. I will place them as one large item that extends from R1 to the end of R2. Then comes the Code Geass manga Queen and Knight. These are a combination of imaginary stories mixed with canon events that occurred in the original anime. To stay consistent with how I've handled cases like this, part of this will be placed here, and part will go into the imaginary stories category. Since Queen and Knight cover the same amount of ground as Fragments of Mosaic, I will again place one large item that extends from R1 to the end of R2. The last entry of this timeline is Maelstrom of Libra, a cancelled video game that introduced Libra, Clovis' sister, and the character Crow. The game starts before R1 and then occurs alongside it. Much like Akito and Oz, this game also doesn't perfectly fit in because there are some contradictions, like how these new characters interacted with legacy ones. So just like with adding Oz in this timeline, this is also something that many won't accept, and that's totally fine. With that, we have discussed every story in the original anime/main timeline. Congratulations, we've gone through 2 timelines already, and we have 28 more to go. Now let's move on to the third timeline in this category, the alternative anime timeline, which is probably the other timeline that you might be familiar with thanks to Lelouch of the Resurrection and Roze of the Recapture. The anime in this timeline made many changes, including Lelouch and Shirley's survival and Miles' exclusion from the main events. Some, however, consider these changes inconsequential in the greater scheme, despite how significant they were. Regardless of where you stand on that, just know that these anime basically followed the main story with many differences. If you can tolerate bad audio, I covered those differences in this video. Thankfully, navigating this timeline won't be as complicated, I promise. First, we start with Renia of Darkness, then comes Film 1, Lelouch of the Rebellion Initiation. The film covers the events from Stage 1 to Stage 17 with changes to the story, including brand new scenes. For the next part, I decided to split Film 2, Lelouch of the Rebellion Transgression, into 2 parts. Everything up to the end of the Black Rebellion and everything that takes place afterward. The reason for this is because Akito the Exiled and Oz of the Reflection are canon to this timeline. To properly place them, I would need to sandwich Akito and 01 in Transgression. Thus, it's simpler to instead say that Transgression Part 1 comes next, followed by Akito the Exiled, and then 01, and then Transgression Part 2. By the way, Oz of the Reflection and Akito the Exiled are referenced in these films. That's how I know they belong in the timeline. Film 2, Lelouch of the Rebellion Transgression, covers everything from stage 18 to turn 17. After Transgression comes Film 3, Lelouch of the Rebellion Glorification, which covers everything from turn 17 to final turn RE, and just like Initiation, there are many changes, new scenes, and things were removed. Also, since O2 takes place alongside the events of R2, in this timeline, it'll take place alongside Transgression and Glorification. I'm also aware that Glorification retconned parts from Oz of the Reflection, like having the Abraham Squadron over the Valkyrie Squadron. Also, Colin killed Kyul instead of almost killing Marika. And when it comes to Akito the Exiled, I think it's safe to assume that the picture dramas and audio dramas belong in this timeline, as well as the rest of the Oz package. Since Libra is referenced in the films, I guess that means that Maelstrom of Libra in some capacity is canon to this timeline. So I'll just place it like how it was in the original anime timeline. Okay, so moving on, we have Lelouch of the Resurrection, the controversial film where Lelouch comes back to life. This isn't the time or place to discuss this, so we can move on to one of the Lelouch of the Resurrection picture dramas that takes place right after the film, so it belongs here. The other one doesn't, so we'll get to that later. Now, unfortunately, we have to move on to Roze of Recapture, even though I would rather not talk about this anime. Roze of Recapture takes place in both Koa Year 3 and Koa Year 7. FYI, Koa years are the years following the Zero Requiem. Lelouch of the Resurrection takes place during Koa Year 2. Originally, I was going to break up Roze of Recapture into two parts based on the years it takes place, but since Pure Almeria clearly doesn't follow this timeline, there's no need to do this. The new manga and photo novels include characters like Schnee. Schnee comes from Lancelot and Gurren, a manga that isn't in this timeline. Pure Almeria also retcons Neo-Britannia's invasion from Koa Year 3 to Koa Year 4, further showcasing how it doesn't belong in this timeline, and I'm sure there'll be more retcons to come. With that in mind, after Lelouch of the Resurrection comes Roze of the Recapture. You guys by now should know about Roze of the Recapture, and if you don't, I got plenty of videos covering it. I would rather not talk about the anime any more than I have to. The last entry is the picture drama for Lelouch of the Resurrection, which takes place 10 years after the film, with Lelouch and C2 now tracking down other Geass fragments, which leads to Garlonzo, that guy with the Geass on his nose. The picture drama also confirms that Lelouch and C2 are a couple at this point. With that, we have finished our discussion on this timeline, and now we are going to start to move into more unknown waters for most of you watching this video. This should be exciting. Next comes the Manga Timeline, which is a combination of the alternative anime timeline and the original anime/main timeline. This timeline has Lelouch of the Resurrection, but also kills off Shirley, hence how it takes from both. With that in mind, let's get started. First comes Renya of Darkness, just like with every other timeline here. Then we got the R1 package, aka the anime, picture drama, and audio dramas. Did things happen exactly the same way? Probably not, but close enough that it can go here, and the same applies to R2. Next comes the Akito the Exile package, followed by O1. After O1 comes the R2 package and O2. Remember that these occur at the same time. With that, we can also include the rest of the Oz package, even though some things probably didn't occur exactly in the same way, but it's probably close enough. There isn't any clarity on this either, and probably only a handful of people even care about this, so I'm not going to stress over it. Now let's talk about the new manga stuff that's exclusive to this timeline. First is Lancelot and Gurren, a manga that adds new characters like Benio, Savitri, Leto, and Schnee. The manga is broken up between Colin and Suzaku's stories, hence the name Lancelot and Gurren. Colin hangs out with Benio and Savitri, and Suzaku works with Leto and Schnee. The story takes place during the events of O1, which occurs right after R1, and continues to the end of R2. There's even parts that occur during the epilogue of the story. The manga also included Pluton in the story, which was a faction introduced in Maelstrom of Libra. Like everything else, this could be a discussion onto itself, so we're just going to move on. Next comes Lelouch of the Rebellion RE, a manga that showcases another perspective of the Zero Requiem. This part overrides the anime version because at the end of Rebellion RE, we can see Lelouch's mind in C's world as he didn't fully die after Suzaku stabbed him. This manga was the key to putting this timeline together since it mentions so many other canon events from the original anime, including Shirley's death and Mao's appearance. This is how I know that the original anime happens in this timeline in some capacity. It feels like most of the changes come in between or after the events, but not many changes to the events themselves. That of course changes with this manga and future manga in this timeline. This manga also references Renya of Darkness, but to be fair, so does Oz. In general, this means that if Oz is canon to something, then so is Renya, and the same applies to Akito the Exile. And this manga also references Oz of the Reflection. Weirdly enough, it isn't consistent with how it incorporates parts of the manga here. I assume it was done that way to avoid redundancy and confusion. There also isn't any references to Lancelot and Gurren, which is strange because that manga came out before this one, and those characters are in Lelouch of the Resurrection. You could probably just read Oz of the Reflection, then Lancelot and Gurren, and go straight to Lelouch of the Rebellion RE if you're a seasoned fan already. And then when you're done with that, you can read Lelouch of the Resurrection manga, which also comes next in our timeline. This manga tells pretty much the same story as the film, with additional content and changes. Between the two, the manga is vastly superior to the film. This one panel alone is proof enough. As I said before, Lancelot and Gurren characters appear in this one, as do the Oz characters. Next comes the Roze Almeria package. Pure Almeria occurs during Koa Year 4, which includes the invasion of the Hokkaido block, which retcons the prologue of Roze, and then comes the main story of Roze recapture that occurs during Koa Year 7. So I'll list Pure Almeria first, followed by Roze of the Recapture. I'm not sure if Maelstrom of Libra is canon to this timeline, since Libra wasn't referenced in these manga. And with that, another timeline is done. Now we're going to discuss the light novels, something that I haven't done much of, if at all, on this channel. Let me preface by saying I haven't read most of these since most of them aren't translated. That's why I haven't discussed them before. I was able to read parts of the R1 light novels because those were translated. Much of what I say here comes from the awesome people behind the new Geass Wiki project. So the novels are read in the following order. First comes the Marianne chapter, then the Daily Island Shock, followed by Red Tracks, R1, Knights of the Round, R2, and the epilogue of the Knights of the Round. These books cover the entire story from the original anime with many changes, hence why it's a separate timeline. The biggest is Joseph Finette working for the Code R project, which isn't outright stated but heavily implied. The novels and the films work in the same way, as both being substitutes for watching the original anime. There are, of course, Akito novels and the aforementioned Oz photo novels. I'm pretty sure these connect to this timeline, so I guess you could place the Akito novels after R1 and the Oz novels after Akito, as we discussed earlier. I know that's confusing, but again, a lot of this stuff is not clearly stated by the authors, so I'm trying to piece things together the best I can. I didn't include the rest of the R1 or R2 package simply because I just don't know enough about these novels to determine what is and isn't canon from the picture dramas or audio dramas. Anyways, with that, another timeline has been successfully navigated. Okay, now it is time to start moving on to the video game. Yep, they're a part of this too. Thankfully, we have done most of the work already, so navigating these shouldn't be too difficult. And just like the other timelines, the video game timelines also fall under this broader category, starting with Lost Colors, the game that stars a new protagonist named Ray. Lost Colors is a visual novel with multiple endings depending on the routes and other decisions that you make. The game has many routes. There is a Geass route, which involves the characters C2, Lelouch, and Nunnally. The Black Knights route, which includes the characters Zero, Colin, and Detard. The Hot Springs, which is a sub-route within the Black Knights route. Then there's the Britannian route with Suzaku and Lloyd if you choose the Engineering Corps. If you choose the Royal Guard, then it involves Cornelia and Euphemia. If you choose the Pure Blood faction, it involves Jeremiah or Valletta. Then moving on, there's the Ashford route, which involves Millie, Shirley, Lelouch, Suzaku, Nunnally, or Nina. Then comes the JLF route. I know, it seems like it never ends. Anyways, this one has Nagisa, Toto, Colin, and Kaguya. And finally, the Blue Moon route, which involves Nunnally, Lelouch, Millie, Yuffie, Kaguya, and C2. Just from these routes, you could get probably over 20 different timelines. This is because there are so many choices you can make with different endings. For example, there are multiple romance options for Ray. This includes Ray attracting cougars like Valletta and Naughted. Lost Colors is basically a dating sim. Now, if all of this seems overwhelming, that's because it is. So here's an easy way to make sense of Lost Colors. I am not going to make each decision with a different ending a new timeline because that's too complicated. I'll leave that to you if you really want to do it. The Geass route is the main timeline of Lost Colors, and the other routes are going to be considered as alternative timelines from the Geass route. This is because the Geass route fits better with the overall events in R1, specifically with Naughted putting Ray back to sleep on Kamina Island. There's even some connections to Lost Stories, where it also implies this is the main branch, if you will. So with that in mind, here is the timelines for Lost Colors. First is the Geass route timeline, which is the main route, and it follows the story of R1, but it ends at stage 19. Ray uses his Geass to make sure everyone forgets him before going back to sleep on Kamina Island. Then there's the first alternative timeline, the BK route, which ends after the SAS in stage 22. Next is the Ashford routes, which end after the school festival in stage 21. Then comes the Britannian route timeline, which also ends at stage 22. The JLF route timeline comes next, and that ends around stage 20 during the Battle of Kyushu, the event with Sawasaki. Next comes the Hot Spring route, which is a sub-timeline of the BK route, and that ends after the Battle of Narita, which occurred in stage 11. I'm not sure about the Blue Moon route timeline, which is more of an imaginary story, because it doesn't really connect with the events of R1 compared to everything else, so they'll just go here as a separate timeline. Also in Code Geass Queen, there is a chapter with Ray in it. I will just say that that chapter always occurs regardless of which route you take for my sanity. One more thing, there is a Code Geass game for the DS that's basically a series of minigames, and it has Ray in it, but I have no idea where that fits in here, so I'll just put it to the side. So that's Lost Colors, a game that I would love to play sometime, assuming the English mods aren't too difficult to set up. Okay, the next game we gotta talk about is the failed gacha game, Code Geass, Genesic Re Code. I know what you're thinking.
Do we have to do this right now?
Yes, we have to. By the way, did you know the game is called Genesic, not Genesis? I made this mistake for years. Why didn't anyone tell me? Anyways, Genesic Re Code is a complicated topic because of how confusing the main story was, plus the new side stories added on top of that. At first, I considered it to be its own thing, but then something changed. Can you guess what it was? That's right, the creators. Thanks to Roze Recapture and Pierre Almeria, it has become clear that Genesic was supposed to connect to future stories in Code Geass. Roze Recapture introduced Sherry May Britannia, a character that Charles Bio also introduced. In the pamphlets for Roze of Recapture, and in Pure Almeria, William Bish is mentioned. Yeah, that's right. The scientist responsible for cloning Charles, who is Norlon, responsible for cloning Marianne, who's M, and whose later research was used by Percy Frankenstein to clone Lelouch. Yep, that's a thing now. Thanks a lot, guys. But don't worry, it gets even better because the new nightmare frames used by the clones, you know, the LDM models, yeah, those things are also referenced in Pure Almeria. In the clone story, one of the clones, Elzvi, mentions that Cornelia was a leader in the Black Knights. This again happened in Roze of the Recapture. So this means that Genesic and what it introduced is in fact part of several timelines that we've already discussed so far. Now, what about Zio of the Yen, Totsuzo of the Unwavering, Crimson of the Blood Pact, and Arthur of the Misty Streets? Either they are all separate timelines that converged during the Fimbul Winter, or they happened in the same timeline. Since the creators stated that Lost Stories and Genesic Re Code are connected, and Lost Stories is basically the manga timeline, it therefore makes sense to conclude that these new stories take place in the same timeline as the main story of Genesic Re Code. Okay, that was quite a mouthful. So how does that play out? There are 3 timelines where Genesic could have happened: the alternative anime timeline, the manga timeline, and the Lost Stories timeline. Given how complex the timelines are, I won't include anything from Genesic Re Code when discussing the Lost Stories timeline. Technically, it should be there, but I don't want to overwhelm you more than I already have. So now let's just go over the 2 timelines with Genesic Re Code, starting with the alternative anime timeline. The timeline now starts with Crimson of the Blood Pact, which takes place in ancient China, then Renya of Darkness, followed by Totsuzo of the Unwavering, which takes place between 1850 and 1869 in Japan, around the same time as Renya of Darkness. This part is kinda confusing since Totsuzo is based on the real person who was born in 1835, and since Totsuzo is 25 in the story, this means it's the year 1860, and that's when Renya takes place. So despite that inconsistency, Totsuzo takes place after Renya of Darkness. Then comes Arthur of the Misty Streets, which then leads to Initiation. Now this part I'm not entirely sure about, which is when did the Fimbul Winter occur? Given how one part of Genesic involved characters not remembering things like how to make the Lancelot Conquista, I am convinced that the Fimbul Winter occurred after Glorification. That explains why the game only showcased nightmare frames from Glorification and not from Lelouch of the Resurrection. This also could be due to the game's early cancellation. Anyways, I slot the Fimbul Winter after Glorification. Next, we gotta talk about the Percy Frankenstein clone story. That story takes place in the year 2035, 17 years after the Zero Requiem, aka Koa Period 17. I'm not going to go over that story since I already did. Anyways, since Roze of the Recapture's main story takes place during Koa Year 7, that means that this clone story takes place after that in the timeline, and also that picture drama. I guess you would need to draw a line to connect that story to the Fimbul Winter, since the conclusion of the clone stories ended during the Fimbul Winter. Then after all of that, many years into the future, we have Zio of the End. This future reminds me of Star Wars, since Zio has a lightsaber that can become a double-bladed saber or remain as dual blades. Based on what I read from the bios, and of course from the gameplay itself, it's a damn shame we never got to see the story take life. So that's the alternative anime timeline with the Genesic stuff included. Now what about Stage 26, Shirley Becoming Zero, the Julius Akito story, and Karma Suzaku? The Genesic Akito story is mostly the same as the OVA, they just added some information about what Julius and Suzaku did before arriving. So no need to include this as a separate timeline, instead we can include it as a prequel before Akito the Exiled in the alternative anime timeline and the manga timeline. Now for the rest of these, they are technically separate timelines. The timeline for the Shirley Zero story follows the original anime timeline, except that Lelouch takes the bullet for Shirley dies and she takes the mantle of Zero. The timeline ends with this Shirley interacting with the Shirley that we know, who's part of the Fimbulwinter. This whole thing was a fabricated timeline that was part of an experiment with KK and the Shogun Zero. Stage 26 follows the original anime, except instead of R2, we get the Stage 26 story, and it also intersects with the Fimbulwinter. Technically, there's another version of Stage 26, which was supposed to take place after Stage 25. Obviously, it never did. I didn't include that one, but I guess you could. Then there's the last new timeline, which is the Karma Suzaku timeline. Maybe the only good thing that came from this game. It mostly follows the original anime timeline with some changes according to the bios of Karma Suzaku. The largest deviation occurs in Stage 18, where Lelouch commands him to be his slave over Liv. This leads to a series of events where Suzaku ends up killing Yuffie and removing one of Zero's eyes. Eventually, his story intersects with the Fimbulwinter, where he works with the Shogun Zero and has a great conclusion to his story after the Fimbulwinter ends. So, while all three of these are separate timelines, they all intersect with either the alternative anime timeline and the manga timeline. I know, this shit just keeps getting even more confusing. The last thing to discuss are the Genesic events, which all seem canon to any timeline where the Fimbulwinter occurred. I went through most of them and didn't notice any inconsistencies with the main story. Instead, it just built on the lore. The only confusing part is where to place them. Since they happened during the Fimbulwinter, I'll just list them as events that happened alongside the same story. So now that I've showed how this looks with the alternative anime timeline, here's what the manga timeline looks like when you apply the Genesic Re code stuff. As you can see, there's not a big difference between the two. Now it's time to move on to the other gacha game, Code Geass Lost Stories. Lost Stories has become the all-inclusive timeline that has everything else included into it, or will at some point in the future. Arguably, you can call it the new main timeline, but I won't. Lost Stories follows the manga timeline with some changes. I know this because Shirley died in this timeline, and we see her helping Lelouch during his resurrection in part 4 of Lost Stories. This happened in the manga, and there's more examples just like this. Now to the changes. First, its version of Akito the Exiled is different from the original OVA. Second, it includes Maelstrom of Libra, since Libra has appeared several times now in Lost Stories. Third, you have the events, which even the fantasy ones are all canon in this timeline because they're told from someone and didn't actually happen. Fourth, Miles' inclusion in the story is off-screen. And finally, the fifth major change is Mario/Maya's story. They are the new protagonists introduced in this game. Their inclusion alters many parts of the anime and manga in this timeline. This includes new lore like Carly, their crazy, hard-eating aunt, and her influence on her assistant Joanna, and minor character Nadira from Lelouch of the Resurrection. There are also other new characters as well introduced as part of the Mario and Maya component to the game. So for this timeline, all I have to do is take the manga timeline and add these boxes along with everything else and alter the text of the current entries to make it clear that they do happen with some changes. That wasn't so bad, right? Well, guess what? Now that I have finished discussing Lost Stories, we have now wrapped up the discussion of all timelines from Category 1. That was 16 in total if you were keeping track. The rest of this is going to be smooth sailing as we go over the remaining timelines in the other two categories. Unlike timelines in the first category, each story in this one is usually the only component of their timeline, and the same applies to the imaginary stories category, so this will take less time to go through. The stories here are classified as alternative retellings because they only follow the basic plot of Code Geass, but alter it so much that it clearly doesn't follow the original anime. But it doesn't go off in a completely different direction like the imaginary stories, which we'll get to later. They are basically the in-between stuff. We can start this off with the Lelouch Other Rebellion manga, which actually came out around the same time as the anime. This manga is probably the closest of these stories in following the plot of the original anime, but still had too many changes. The best examples include not including key characters like Cornelia and Detard and the absence of nightmare frames. It also removed or altered events and changed the order in which they happened. Now, some people dismiss the manga because of these changes, and that's a shame because I like this manga and in some ways it's an improved version of the original anime. I know that's not a popular opinion, but read it for yourself and you'll see what I mean. The next timeline is Nightmare of Nunnally, which is based on the manga Nightmare of Nunnally. In this manga, Nunnally gains a Geass power that turns her into a nightmare frame. It involves parallel universes, a complex topic that I do not want to talk about right now. It also has a Zero Armor costume and other wacky stuff. I won't discuss this one further because it needs its own dedicated video. Even Lost Stories referenced it during the Nunnally and Wonderland story. Oh, and apparently Nightmare of Nunnally has its own novels, so I'll add those to the timeline. Next comes the Suzaku of the Counterattack timeline based on the manga of the same name. This is a condensed version of the original anime with many changes, obviously, most of them involving Suzaku. Who would have guessed that? My favorite is the Lancelot costume from the Ashford Academy episodes, becoming an actual armor that Suzaku wears. Next comes the Tales of the Alternative Shogunate, based on the manga of the same name. Imagine Code Geass but with wooden nightmare frames and an ancient Japanese aesthetic, plus a chibi design style, and that's this manga. Then comes Chibi Geass for Como no Lelouch, a timeline based on the manga of the same name. For the longest time, I had no idea what this was, since finding it online was impossible. Recently, thanks to the awesome people on my Discord server, I was able to find it online, but it wasn't translated. Just like with Queen and Knight, I have no idea if anything is canon or not. The manga is a mix of maybe canon events, imaginary stories, and something in between. The entire premise, as its name suggests, is a more comedic version of Code Geass with chibi versions of the characters. I'm gonna put it here. Arguably, it doesn't belong in this category, but that's where it's going. In the future, if it ever gets translated and I get a proper understanding of it, I'll probably end up placing it in a different category. The last entry is another exception, and that is the Nunnally and Wonderland timeline. The story is just a dream, so it's imaginary. That's not the problem. The problem lies in continuity, because it includes R2 characters when this clearly takes place in R1. This is because of what Nunnally is wearing and the fact that she's with Lelouch. Based on the dream itself, it includes things from the original anime, like a Wonderland version of the Damocles. So in my opinion, Lelouch invented this world from what happened in the real world. So this entire story takes place after R2, which also doesn't make any sense. Nunnally's eyes should be open and Lelouch should be dead. Lelouch obviously can't dream if he's dead, nor can he remember things that he doesn't know exist. This is why I have concluded that these versions of Lelouch and Nunnally are going through events of the original anime, just in a different way. That would classify this as being part of this category. I am probably overthinking this, but that's kind of the point of the video. Category 2 is now complete. Let's move on to the final category, which are imaginary stories. Now we have come to the last category, imaginary stories. These are stories that have the same characters and similar enough setting from the original anime and even the extended universe, but do not follow the original story. Most of these timelines consist of just one story per timeline, just like before. Now, before going over the timelines, I should note that the events in Lost Stories, such as the Magia or God Rebellion, will not be included here. Those stories are imaginary, which is true, but they're told by characters within the Lost Stories timeline, meaning they didn't actually happen. Another example of this is the story of Nunnally in Wonderland, not the part with Lelouch and Nunnally, but the dream itself. Now on to the timelines. When if Lelouch worked in a store with other Black Knight members and competed against another store run by Britannian workers? Well, that's the plot of Code Geass, Lelouch of the Sales manga, the first timeline in this category. There isn't Geass that I'm aware of. It's just Lelouch running a store and all the funny stuff that happens while doing it. The timeline does reference the original anime because Lelouch has a manga with a Zero-like character in it. Anyways, that's that timeline. Earlier in this video, when discussing R2, I mentioned that audio dramas are both canon and not canon to the story. So let's add a timeline for all of the R2 dramas that are collectively imaginary stories. I can't find translation for all of these, but if you look at the cover for these audio dramas, it's clear that some of them didn't happen in the original anime. Okay, that timeline is done. Let's move on to the next one. Now let's move on to the first part of the OVA, Miraculous Birthday. This clearly didn't happen because Rollo, Shirley, and Lelouch didn't appear as ghosts to help the Ashford students, Nunnally's eyes are closed, and so forth. So everything before the slideshow of what happened after R2 is clearly imaginary. And unlike other imaginary stories, it isn't told by anyone or occurred in a dream. This was some fantasy story created to give some closure on the tragic deaths in Code Geass, or maybe it was created in celebration of Code Geass, hence the name. Either way, it goes into this category as its own separate timeline. Let's also add another timeline for all the imaginary stories that took place in Code Geass Queen and Knight. Moving on, what if Lelouch could play guitar and start a band at Ashford and compete against other bands? That's the plot of the manga Code Black, Lelouch of the Shred Guitar. The story was referenced in Lost Stories, and since then we've gotten other band-like events. So that's that timeline. Maybe in the future, if I could read the translations, I could discuss it more in depth. And last, and certainly not least, in the imaginary stories category is the manga Lelouch of the Tutor. This is a version of Code Geass where Lelouch became C2's tutor in a world with no Geass or invasion of Japan. It's a slice of life story where everyone lived and hangs out at Ashford Academy. And so far, it's still my favorite Code Geass manga, and I would love to see it adapted someday. Kind of like a Fumafu version of Code Geass. If you don't know what that is, it was a spin-off story in Full Metal Panic. For those that have never read Lelouch of the Tutor, thankfully there are fan translations online, and I highly recommend you do. It's a really good read. Now, you might be thinking, wait, what about Super Robot Wars, the video game series where many mecha anime franchises come together? Or what about the infinite collaborations between Code Geass and something else? Or what about other video games like Another Century, which also combines different mecha anime franchises together? I didn't include any of that here because it would be way too complicated to cover. I mean, the Super Robot Wars games have separate timelines based on the titles, so it's more than just listing each game out. Also, how can my discussions on the collaborations ever be complete when more come out all the time? Maybe in another timeline in our own universe, I could have covered it. You could technically put all of this stuff into a new fourth category called Code Geass Collaborations if you want. That really wouldn't do it justice, but it's better than nothing, I guess. This means there are actually more than 30 timelines in Code Geass, which was already true based on other things that we discussed. I can't wait to find out what we're getting in the future to further complicate this topic. Now you understand why this video took so long to make. With this video's completion, I now have 4 major projects left to finish. The Saz Massacre discussion, Fixing Cornelia, Turn 19, and the Geass Iceberg. Hopefully, they won't take as long as this one to come out. Editor chops here. I realized extremely late into production that I messed up and forgot about the Code Geass DS game. So let's talk about it. So that game belongs in category 1 because it follows the original anime timeline with some changes, like the introduction of Pollux and Castor, who are twins and members of the royal family. One of their nightmare frames was later developed into the Vercingetorix. I think this game also had multiple endings, but it's region locked, so I don't know for sure. Anyways, here is a quick rough timeline of how it would look. Okay, now let's get back to the video. Damn, that was a long one. If you got this far, thanks so much for watching, and let me know your thoughts on anything involving the world of Code Geass. Take care.